healthcare. And today we are here to talk about the very important topic of around gender. And our topic that we're focusing on today is impact for data for impact, harnessing impact of gender disaggregated data and gender disaggregated indicators. So moving forward, I would like to introduce our very esteemed speakers today. First, we have Dr. Hadia Majid. She's the co-director of Gentech and chair of the Department of Economics at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. Dr. Majid's extensive research actually focuses on women's access to economic opportunities and empowerment. We also have Ms. Fauzia Vikar with us. Ms. Fauzia is the Federal Ombudsperson for Protection Against Harassment at Workplace, Government of Pakistan, and Ms. Vikar has decades of experience in women's rights and human rights, and having previously, she has headed the Punjab Commission on the Status of Women. Before we move forward, please do share your questions using the Q&A tab below, and we would love to answer all your questions and engage with you on them. We'll be spending the first 40 to 45 minutes hearing from our participants, panelists, and learning from the great experience, and then we'll come to the Q&A. Without further ado, let's get started. I would like to invite Dr. Hadia Majid to kick off our discussion with the insights on why it is crucial for countries to collect and analyze gender disaggregated data to address gender inequalities. Dr. Majid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zora, and thank you for inviting me to this fantastic panel. I'm so thrilled to be even remotely close to where Fauzia is and sharing the space with her. I'm just in awe of the work that Fauzia does, and I'm so delighted to be a part of this very important conversation. So you asked about why it's crucial for countries to collect and analyze gender disaggregated data. So as an economist, we tend to deal with averages, and we all know the pitfalls when you look at averages. Averages tend to hide inequalities, they tend to hide distributions. Any population that is marginalized, any population that is vulnerable, any population that is likely to be below the mean is going to be hidden if you just look at averages. So if you really want to understand what's going on with marginalized communities, and women are one of those marginalized communities, then you really need to look at data categorically aimed at understanding what their condition is like. And then let me give you an example. Let's take the example of school attendance. So if I look at averages of school attendance, and if I look at average literacy rates for a country like Pakistan, I'd be like, oh, that's great. Pakistan's literacy has improved over time, right? What that hides for me, if I don't go into the nitty-gritty of it, is how have the measures or the indicators of literacy changed over time. Maybe we're just moving the bar down when we want to understand, or when we want to categorize or measure literacy. The other thing that it would hide for me is dropout rates during particular seasons, dropout rates for particular populations, dropout rates for girls versus boys. So if I really want to get a full picture of what's going on, I need to disaggregate. Now, one of the disaggregates that we look at is gender. I can look at other disaggregates too. And from economy's perspective, gender is something that I should be really concerned about, and I look at very closely, because half of your population is women. So if we don't know what's going on with them, and we know that they're one of the marginalized, vulnerable groups, then you miss out on half the picture. So if you really want to understand what's happening in your economy, if you want to improve outcomes, and we know that if we improve outcomes for women, that has multiplier effects for children, it has multiplier effects for your next generation. So whether I look at it from an instrumentalist perspective, or I look at it from an intrinsic perspective, knowing what's happening with women is key. And I've intentionally talked about women, but we can talk about gender more broadly as well, if that's where you want to take the discussion. I'm going to hand over to Fauzia now, if that's all right with you, Zora.
Ms. Fauzia, please do share examples from all the great work that you've done with the government in Punjab and at the center. It would be really great for audiences.
And thank you, Zora, for this opportunity. It is really good to be here. And Hadia and I have worked together also. I completely, I would like to just reinforce what Hadia is saying, and I completely agree with her on the fact that if you want to get a good picture or a reasonable picture of where women are at, you need the data. I just want to take it a little bit further and say that in a country like mine and in other developing countries, data plays an even more important role because of the fact that there is generally a misconception that women are doing better than how they're actually doing. And in such scenarios, it is only data that helps human rights activists like myself to make the picture clearer and convince people that the story is quite different. And I have used many stories from data to immediately be able to convince people on the need for investing in women. It is only recently that in a country like mine, like ours, and we're currently both based in Pakistan, there was and there continues to be a misconception that women are part of decision making, women are respected, and the indicators that I use for women's perceived empowerment are, for instance, respect. And that it's hard to convince people that does not necessarily translate into empowerment. And for that, data on decision making, data on participation in decision-making forums, data on education, on health, on economic empowerment, most importantly, is needed to convince people. I have had many opportunities and I continue to have opportunities to engage with decision makers. And it normally, initially, whenever a human rights argument was going to be made, and especially with regards to women, it used to be brushed aside. And if it was seen as anecdotal, it was seen as subjective. And if ever data was tried, I tried to use data, people generally rejected it as it being non-government data, right? And skewed data. And therefore, I feel like having national data sets, having rigorous data sets has been able to shift the argument on its head, turn the arguments on its head. And for me, especially, data is a very, very powerful tool in convincing the decision makers who I'm part of, whose training I'm part of, that this is neither anecdotal nor subjective. This is actually a lot of times administrative data also. And I think it's been a very productive situation. Now, whether it has translated into results, let's take that in another question or as the conversation flows, and I'll just let you pose that.
No, thanks so much for sharing it. While data is very, very important, as you mentioned, to understand what the issues, understand how deeply those issues are penetrated in our communities, understanding how we can make the right decisions. While there's a lot of data being collected, a lot more needs to be done when it comes to data collection and to institutionalizing the practice of collecting that data regularly, analyzing it. So my question to you will be with you to Ms. Fauzia, and then we'll go to Hadia, is that what steps can governments, and in the case of Pakistan, a country like Pakistan, which the national and the provincial governments can take to institutionalize the collection and analysis of gender disaggregated data, so that data is regularly collected, analyzed, and is that practice institutionalized and not just dependent on, not just a one-off thing?
I think the first and foremost need is to collect data, because while we have surveys and we have the very rare census, including the recent one, which is now no longer very recent, those are no longer reliable because the population of Pakistan is growing so rapidly that the data sets become redundant very soon, unless and until the surveys are made more frequent, and unless and until we start collecting rigorous administrative data. In Pakistan, the trend of collection of administrative data is increasing, which is helpful. And the one thing that the government needs to do is to start collecting administrative data better, look at all the indicators on which data is being collected and augment those indicators, because currently we tend to follow international models. Like, for instance, we have the multiple index cluster service, which is being used, and it is being done quite frequently. And I think it's a fabulous survey, and it gives a really good insight into women's conditions, women and children's conditions especially. Even looks into their decision making, for instance, or their asset ownership. However, there are a lot of things that are still getting missed. And one of the things that I feel is getting missed is the intersectionality of marginalization. And for that, I relied specifically on a survey that I was lucky to oversee, or rather lead. In that, it was an economic and social well-being of women survey. And in that, we realized that the achievements were different for women who belong to religious minorities, for instance. So there was the baseline, which was the Muslim majority women, and then there was the religious minority women, and the outcomes were different for them. So looking at, for instance, further disaggregating it and taking care of the intersectionality is important. Similarly, other very crucial data, and one that comes to mind is not being collected, is the transition from education to employment. Again, through that survey that I'm talking about, it is found out that in Punjab, about 22% women achieved higher education, which goes grade 12 and above. And of that, only 5.5% transitioned into employment. That's a very alarming number for me, right? And I frankly would not have understood that, because we don't get this figure easily. Maybe it's being collected in normal data sets, but this doesn't really jump out as this way. Similarly, the NEET rate, which is not in education, employment, or training, that is a very important indicator on which to collect data in Pakistan because of the burgeoning youth population. And you will be upset to hear that the NEET rate, which is children between the ages of 18 and 24, I believe, who are neither in education or employment or training, constitute about a whopping 46% of the population, of that youth population. So the government needs to start improving the data that it is collecting and then to institutionalize it. Unfortunately, when it comes to women, we are still at the point where you don't even have a central data set which collects the number of cases of violence against women, which is as hard a data indicator as you can get. But you do not have a consolidated repository of that information on the violence against women across Pakistan. You will have to rely on probably non-governmental data for that. So institutionalizing it and then creating a central repository. Those are some of the important things that the government needs to do to improve the data, the usage of that data. Over to Hadia.
Dr. Hadia, drawing on what Ms. Fauzia has shared, anything that you would like to add, especially with regards to how the government can really, institutionalize the collection of and analysis of gender disparity data? We know a lot of it being collected, but still a lot more needs to be done, especially when it comes to institutionalizing it and analyzing it. So, any thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, if you look at the trends that have been in place for the last 10, 15 odd years, particularly in the last 5 years, I think post-COVID, there has been a lot of pressure, particularly from grant agencies, to include gender in the analysis. But I think what we need to be careful about is to what extent is this cosmetic and to what extent is this real disaggregation when it comes to gender. Because if we need to, you can add a gender component anywhere. You just ask the question on gender and then you cut the data by gender. And you're going to find some gender. I mean, I can claim that that's gender disaggregation. But that's not truly getting to the heart of figuring out what is happening at the socio-economic, political level representation that Fauzia also talked about, to really see from the grassroots how our economy treats women, or what are the outcomes for women, or what are the barriers for women. So for that, I think you need to take stock for every single part of the process, right? From when you define a research question that you're about to go into the field and collect data on something, to whether or not your instrument design is conducive to getting information about women from women for women. So what time are you going to do the instrument, to field the instrument? Who is your enumerator a woman or a man? What kind of questions are you asking? Are you making it sure that women in the household are going to be comfortable talking about this? So what is your instrument design like? Who is doing the question taking? How are you gathering the survey? Is your design participatory? Are you going into the communities and talking to women, talking to the community leaders, figuring out how women are treated? What are the barriers that they face? And then even when we talk about gender disaggregated analysis, I think what we tend to forget is who is doing the analysis. The way that a man is going to cut the data is going to be very different from the way a woman is going to cut the data. So I think talking about institutionalizing data collection, data analysis, we tend to think that, oh, we'll make gender a component. We'll ask about violence, or we talk about decision making. We'll find out who makes the decisions. And yes, that's all very good. But you need to go a little bit deeper. You need to think about how the data is being collected, who is part of the design process, who is part of the analysis process. And then what exactly, the reason why I brought up the research question is that when I'm trying to figure out access versus control over assets like land, the data that I'm going to feed, or the instrument that I'm going to feed, might look very different from if I was to go in and figure out whether or not women have access to and control over digital technologies and digital resources. So the type of instrument that you design, whether you choose to take qualitative versus quantitative surveying, that also matters. And there needs to be mechanisms in place that we think through all of these things and are continually going back and revisiting processes and having that positive feedback loop. Only then will we start seeing that that body of data, which Fauzia is referring to, so that we can affect real change.
Great. No, thanks so much. Sorry, I think there's an internet lag. Dr. Haji, you were saying something?
No, I'm done.
Okay, great. Ms. Fauzia, when talking about gender disaggregated data and institutionalizing gender data, a great example in Pakistan is the GMIS, the Gender Management Information System, which was developed by the Punjab Commission of Status of Women a few years back. So it'd be great if you could share some insight from your experience of developing that great database and how it was used. And it's one of the great examples of how gender data was collected and it was being consolidated in one place in Punjab. So over to you.
Thank you. So just to back up a little, in 2016, we decided to create a database primarily relying on administrative data in the province of Punjab, which has a population of, had a population at that time of over 105 million and has grown significantly since then. And the idea was to look into how women were faring and how that could feed into the governmental planning, especially with regards to expenditures on women. And also for guiding us on what particular development projects needed to be undertaken in order to improve women's status or situation in Punjab, the province of Punjab. And the way we went about it is that started with developing a set of indicators, some of which data was available from the various departments of the government of Punjab, but going not staying at the provincial level, but also going down to the local level. So engaging the local governments also and getting their data also. Ultimately, a gender MIS was created, which had over 300 indicators. And for that, an outreach to over 1,000 government offices needed to be made. It sounds like a mind-boggling number, but believe me, there are more government offices than 1,000. Because we wanted to find out, for instance, how many women, basic data as to how many women were working in a particular office, because the government of Punjab had, at that time, brought in a women's empowerment package in which it was mandated that there is going to be at least 15% representation of women in all public sector institutions. Similarly, there was another part of that policy package which said that at least 33% women in the public sector boards, committees, and task forces is mandatory. Great steps. Similarly, there were, or rather, yet another provision of that package was to find out with regards to improving a lot of religious minority women, or stipends for girls and all. But we all know how things go, that policy proclamations are made and then nothing happens about it. So with the simple objective of trying to figure out how that was faring, which was brought in, it started in 2012, and various packages were subsequently announced for 2014, 2016, 2017, etc. So we just wanted to figure out where things were at with regards to implementation of those packages. And we started to collect data, and fortunately, there was support. So with these 1,000 plus institutions, we started to figure out what was happening. Now, I just said there were over 300 indicators, and some of the results were as expected. For example, in institutions like the Forest Department or the Police Department. In the Forest Department, actually, we found out that the representation was women was close to none. In the Police Department, it was low. In Pakistan, we have just about 1% women in the police. That was to be expected. But there were also some very interesting and unexpected revelations. And I would like to share just a couple of them. For example, in Pakistan, especially in the metropolitan cities, you see a lot of women driving motor vehicles. And the expectation was that the motor vehicle registration in the names of women, which should have grown phenomenally. Or there are so many women drivers, so their licenses should be many. So I can tell you that in 2016, when the first data set was analyzed, we found out that the motor vehicle registration in the largest city of Punjab, which is Lahore, and the most developed city of Punjab, which is Lahore, motor vehicle registration in the names of women stood at just 1%. I have to tell you, and this is with some humor, even today, when I teach or rather discuss it with policymakers, that it stood at 1% and has marginally grown, I think, to 3% by now, they just cannot believe it. That was a story that even I found unexpected, but a good case in point. Similarly, in order to cross-reference it, we tried to figure out how many motor vehicle driving licenses were given in a particular year. And that stood at about 5% and hasn't grown significantly since then. So those are some of the results that came out of it. And slowly and gradually, we realized, I initially thought that it would be difficult to collect that data. But slowly and gradually, I realized that when there was a government institution behind it, and there was a commitment of the government behind this initiative, the department started to send that data quite eagerly. I shouldn't say eagerly, but easily, rather. And afterwards, I also was very happy to see that, for instance, the police, once confronted with that data, took concrete measures to induct more women in the police. As a consequence, I'm reminded of, I think it was 2017, that the police inducted 500 women on the position of a Muharrar. Muharrar is a very important position for those of the international audience who don't understand, in a police station, who documents a particular crime. And that documentation cannot be challenged all the way up to the once documented, that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of Pakistan and all the appellate forums, and therefore it has an extremely crucial value. And 500 women were, for the very first time in the history of Pakistan, were inducted into that position, and it was found that very bright women were available for that. So that's how that data set came along. Now, once that data set became available, it was across those indicators in 7 areas, 6 of which were the regular, for example, demographics, economic empowerment, violence against women, education, health, etc. One particular pillar of that data set was tracking government's initiatives. I think that was the most rewarding. And I think the important aspect, or rather the important leg of that entire journey, was that at the end of the year, that had to be analyzed, and the results had to be presented to all the senior government officials, so that they could be, they could be apprised of how they were doing. And they started to resent sometimes also, but also started to take ownership of that and do things better. That was the gender MIS. And then I know that you only asked me about gender MIS, but I felt like there was also a need to augment beyond those indicators. And that's where the economic and social empowerment of women, social well-being of women, we called it, in Pakistan, or rather, sorry, in Punjab. That data set was also created, which was a nationally representative data set. And it had, excuse me, forgive me, I have a really bad throat. Anyway, so that particular data, the survey, it was a nationally representative survey. It sampled about, based on the survey blocks or census blocks that were created in 2017, I believe. And that returned, like I just shared earlier, that returned very unique results, which hitherto had not been collected in 5 domain areas. And I can talk about it more, but I don't want to hog the show.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing these very amazing examples. And it's really great to see that data was not only being collected, it was actually being shared with the right decision makers, so they can have a shared understanding of it, and then the actions being taken around it. That's a very good example of that. You can't solve a problem if you don't know that it exists and to the extent to which it exists. And that's what data does, brings with itself, that it helps you understand the problem, the extent of it, and then that's super important when we're addressing a problem to any action. So talking about gender disaggregated data, Dr. Hadia, what do you think? How can gender disaggregated data collection be integrated into the existing national data systems and processes? So while there's like Ms. Fawzia mentioned that there was a gender MIS form, but there are also a lot of existing national data systems and data being collected regularly through many large-scale surveys that are happening in the country, and they happen very frequently, every few years or every year. So what can be done to ensure that the right indicators are there? And what are some indicators that you would really like to see that they should include, and which are very crucial for Pakistan, considering where we are as a country and where we are when it comes to women's rights, access to opportunities?
Sure. So, Zohra, I think it's important to disaggregate this question into 2 parts, and some of it goes back to some things that Fawzia has said. So one is administrative data, and then the other is surveys. I think that there is, like Fawzia mentioned, quite a bit of administrative data being collected already. This idea that how many motor vehicles are registered in women's name, how much land is registered in women's name, how many unique tax identifiers are there which are registered under a woman. These are all really important points that we can gather, right? Similarly, how many firms are registered under women's names? So one thing is we want to know just the state of the economy. And I think it's important for us to know this. Now, once we've had the state of the economy, that we know what kind of assets, the extent of assets are registered under women's name, then it becomes important through surveys to really try and figure out, does access mean control? What does it mean in terms of outcomes? What does it mean in terms of reducing barriers, reducing inequalities, so on and so forth? So one, I would say, is just taking stock. And for that, even things like how many women directors are there, how many women board members are there, this is all information that is available. It is available in a very sort of, it's available somewhere out there. It all needs to be brought together. That is one system that can be created, how to bring all of these cogs together and how to start using it to make a better picture. Then the other is surveys that help us go deeper into certain specific questions. And then one thing, and I will come to this, is panel surveys. We don't do enough tracking. So this, what Fauzia said towards the beginning of this conversation, that, you know, you have women who have graduated, and then you know how many, so I know how many women are going into higher school, and then I know how many women are going into the labor market. Is there a survey that tracks for me as you move throughout your educational career and then you move towards the labor market? And we have examples from other countries which we can use. There's the Young Life Survey that is done in the US. We can do something similar. It's an expensive exercise, absolutely. But if we're doing a national survey every couple of years in any case, which we do for the PSLM, for the LFS, etc., then why not start a national panel survey which just tracks populations? Now, what would I like to see in terms of indicators? The labor force survey asks this really great set of questions on time poverty, and that's fantastic. We want to know how women are spending their time. What really gets to me every time as a labor economist is that they ask this only of non-working women. I want to know how working women are spending their time too. The PSLM has recently started asking about asset ownership, particularly land ownership for men versus women. And I think, if I remember correctly, that's only for agricultural land. I want to know residential land ownership. I want to know all sorts of land ownership, because land is such an important asset. And we know how important it is for when it comes to decision making. So we know from the literature that there are many variables that we want to know at the gender disaggregated level, even things like consumption. How much meat is consumed by the girls in the household versus the boys in the household? How much spending is taking place for the girls in the household on health versus boys in the household on health? Now, we have a very pages long consumption survey in the HIAS, but we don't have gender disaggregated data there. Now, it's important for us to balance the cost of these surveys against what these surveys will tell us. And that's why it's so important to go back to what is it that we're exactly taking stock of. If, as an economy, we are committed to improving the lives of the women and through it lives of our children, then I think it's worth investing in these particular indicators. But I do want to play a bit of a devil's advocate over here and push back a little bit on the question that you had asked, that how do we integrate gender data into existing national systems? I don't know if I want to do that, because the existing national systems would need a complete overhaul, because as it exists right now, these are not very conducive to gathering the sort of gender disaggregated data. The enumerators need to be retrained. The instruments need to be thought of very carefully. We really need to be thinking about the options in terms of the answers for the questions as well. So it's not just enough that you just put in a question and ask, oh, who owns the land? Is it a man or a woman? This is a sensitive question. It's a question that may be taboo in certain parts of the country. So you have to really think about the wording of the question. You have to really think about how will the enumerator ask this question, when the survey should it be placed. So it's not just about adding the gender question into existing national systems. It's about, can the existing national data systems be changed so that they're more conducive to gathering data on gender? I'm going to stop here.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. And thanks so much for sharing all the great examples of the indicators that don't exist and that need to exist to understand the problems, the challenges more deeply. Ms. Fauzia, any thoughts on the indicators that needs to, be collected, the data that needs to be collected against some indicators that you'd like to recommend that should be there and are not, or some indicators that are being collected, but the right data is not there? So any thoughts on that?
I just want to build actually on what Hadia had said about the training, because having had a very stark personal experience on that count with regards to the economic and social well-being survey, it's interesting. A lot of time was spent into developing the indicators and then also training the enumerators. We had the luxury, I would say, of hiring private sector enumerators who did not carry biases. Government has its own ways of doing it, and with that develop some biases. So we were able to do that, and so we trained them, and then we sent them out into the field. And it's interesting that when the results started to come for the violence against women pillar of that data set, we realized that the results were fairly skewed. And thankfully, there was a strong supervision and monitoring of that process. When we asked to find out what happened over there, I realized that people were unable to ask questions related to violence because they said that when they go into a house, first of all, the mother-in-law, sometimes the father-in-law, the husband, they all come and sit with the woman. Asking that question becomes an impossibility naturally. I remember one of the enumerators who said that she had to spend 2.5 hours just to get that level of comfort with the family, that the others would leave the woman alone and they could ask particular questions related to her personal health and safety, the woman's personal health and safety. And only then. Then we had to pull out all the teams from the field, and it was an expensive exercise. Bring them back, get them through another 2-day training, help them navigate that particular issue, then send them back into the field and then get slightly better results. So while I'm not so despondent about having to overhaul the national data collection system, I feel like there has to be a serious retraining. The good thing is, Zohra, now that with this influx of social media information and people's way of engaging with things or engaging with information has changed. You cannot isolate even the government officials from that. So the government officials now realize that business as usual is no longer possible. Also, that initial cohort, which was there when social media was introduced or online communication was introduced, has transitioned into retirement and all. The new lot thinks a little bit differently, or at least are a little bit open to improving their ways as they say, and have some background in engaging with technology. So I feel like leveraging all of those factors, the survey statistics collection agencies, for example, there's the Bureau of Statistics, Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, there is the Bureau of Statistics Punjab. They can all be retrained and retrained, then sent into the field, and then of course then there has to be a review of the indicators. I'm sometimes a little distressed with how much data is being collected. There are so many data systems, and I once did an exercise whereby I was looking at the various data systems and trying to figure out which was collecting what, and I realized that there was a tremendous overlap. And the same data, I'm sure there's going to be a respondent fatigue also with that, where you're going back to the population, collecting the same data over and over again. And I don't know how authentic then that remains also. So we need to look at that duplication also, and perhaps revise our surveys, perhaps reduce our surveys rather than increase them, and improve our indicators.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And thank you for really highlighting an important point that as much as the right indicators are important when collecting data, it's also important, if not equally, that the people who are collecting that data in the field have the right training, have the right understanding of what these questions are and how to collect that data. So they're able to get the right information from the field, and they're able to really, get the right answers, which are super important when it comes to, any data collection effort. And talking about that a lot of data is being collected in the country. Thanks for sharing that. And we do see a lot of surveys happening, but here we come to another question at this point is how much of that is being translated into decision-making, into actual policies, into actual actions on ground. So I'll start with Dr. Hadia asking you, what are some best practices to translate this data that's being collected into policy and practice? If there's an example that you can share, or if there's something that should happen and is not happening, we'd love to hear from you on that.
So Zohra, I have to admit that I had made notes for each one of the questions that you had shared before, and I have the least amount of notes for this. So for me, a real pet peeve at this point is the whole smart economics idea. The idea that You want to invest in women because it's instrumentally of significance, because investing in women is smart economics, because you get to achieve a lot of goals at the same time. So if I invest in the girls' education, yes, it is intrinsically important, but I get the biggest bang for my buck, because investing in the girl means that health outcomes are going to be better, investment in the next generation is going to be better. So it's going to take the economy on this, multiplier effect with it kick in, and it is going to take the economy, allow the economy to really sort of take off. I want us to really, in terms of best practices, start thinking more about investing in women, reducing gender inequalities, understanding more about what we need to do right by our women in order to not just achieve things from a smart economics perspective, but from just an intrinsic perspective. So improving their position, reducing their inequalities, because women are citizens of this world and they deserve to see the same quality of life that men have, or other advantaged groups might have. So I think in this, the intersectionality that Fawzia referred to a little while ago, that's really key. There are so many vulnerabilities that tend to intersect and tend to reduce outcomes even further. So a woman belonging to a lower caste household or to belonging to a lower income household living in a rural area is going to be much worse off than the same type of woman, a low income woman, low caste household, but living in the urban center. So when you think about how do you improve women's outcomes, I want us to be thinking more in an intrinsic fashion, not just from an instrumentalist perspective. And two, I want us to be thinking more from an intersectional perspective, and sort of incorporating that in the systems of data collection, data analysis, data gathering, so that we can adequately address these kind of problems. I'm happy to come back to this if you like, but I'm going to stop for now.
And no, thank you for sharing. You shared a point very close to my own heart that we should invest in women for women and not just for this larger narrative of the next generation and economy and etc. Just first invest in women and improve their lives for them without thinking of how it will, add largely to our other aspects of economy or children, etc. Well, that is also very important. But Ms. Fawzia, coming to you, talking about translating data into practice and policy, any best practices that you would like to highlight or anything that you would like to see which is not happening, which should happen?
Frankly speaking, first of all, even though I've said just a little while ago that there is a lot of data out there, there is still data that is missing. For example, I feel like GMIS, which was started in Punjab, needs to be instituted across Pakistan in all the provinces, and then there could be a national data set, which I think the national government is working on. But right now, it is only in Punjab, and unfortunately, none of the provinces have been able to replicate it. And I can tell you that this is only because of, I guess, lack of leadership or insufficient priority that is given still to women's empowerment. And there might be a lot of narrative on SDGs and SDG 5 and needing to promote the women's empowerment, but it hasn't translated into actuals like, for instance, even starting with a gender management information system nationally, even if it's not at the provincial level. There could be that's what needs to be done. Secondly, and I think that's not just a women's issue, women and data issue, is that our policies are still not being informed by data in Pakistan. We are still up our development planning. Our planning in general is informed by political considerations and not based on data or, as we call them, informed policy making. There is an appetite, and there's a growing appetite, I have to say that, in the government also and among political figures. But we still have a lot of work. We need to invest a lot in informed policy making. And unless there's that culture change, all that data that we are happy generating is going to waste. And I will start with an admission of guilt that even though I've given you some good examples, I feel like the GMIS has been unable to achieve even 20% of its potential. It can do so much more based on the information that it is generating or the other data sets. I had the opportunity of working in Balochistan recently and was able to uncover some horrendous data. And everybody agreed to that data, but then when it comes to development planning, for example, not enough premium is laid or placed in using that information towards development planning, right? Now, that is, we have the good practices. I can't say best, but we have the good practices. But we have to change the political culture. We have to change the culture of policy making. I'm not sure how far a house from that's going to be. The other thing is, and I feel that's very important, that we have bought into the SDGs and the international reporting. The data is very important for international reporting also. In fact, whether we like it or not, we have to report to the international community. Sometimes it's for economic reasons also, and I hate to make an economic argument for women's human rights, but well, the government has to report on that, right? So even for that, unfortunately, we haven't been able to go to the levels of gender disaggregation, forget about the other markers that the SDGs require. So we'll have to get to it. And I hope that the government is going to be able to do that, but I don't know when that's going to happen. I feel like we cannot ignore data collection and data-informed policy making. Now we are not isolated from the world, so we'll have to do it. Long way to go. Not a very rosy picture, sorry. And sorry, there's a question by Umar. And he's talked about GMIS. So Umar, just, I don't know if you can hear me. There is, GMIS is very active. And in fact, I'm on this panel, I opened it. They just changed the interface, and I really don't like the interface because it doesn't clearly, it seems like a lot of narrative. It doesn't seem like a data set, but if you go hover on it, it is going to return indicators. And unfortunately, it's just up to 2021 right now. Should be a little bit more, but it does work, and it is showing up indicators.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. We have one more question. I think we have partially answered that question. Actually, we have answered to it to a large extent, and that is that how can you bridge this divide between utilizing data and collecting data and utilizing it? And I think some of that you've already addressed, and it's really good to know that there's increasing appetite for evidence-based policy making. There's increasing appetite of using data and using it to inform policy, inform decisions and actions. Is there anything else that you would like to add to this question? Respond to this question, Ms. Fawzia?
Sorry, you'll have to repeat the question for me again.
The question is, how can we effectively utilize data we already have gathered, and how can we bridge the divide between collecting data and then using it? Make better use of our existing data.
I'm not sure how much I can add to it. I can only say that right now our data collection agencies, they are only seen as technical agencies. They should have a seat on the table in all policy making forums and be an integral part of that policy making. I feel like that is going to help better utilization of that particular data. That's
Great. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question, and I think that's not just limited to data, but this particular question talks about how we mentioned that a lot of data is being collected and there may be some duplication of effort. So how do we make sure there's no duplication of effort in government department, especially in a difficult political economy? I think this question goes beyond just data collection. It's more about action and policy making. So any quick thoughts on that?
Sure. From my perspective, and Adya, you're welcome to jump in. And I'm going to restrict myself to data for women at the moment, right? Or rather for women's empowerment. Or rather not just data for women's empowerment. I'm just going to focus broadly on how informed policy making for women and women's empowerment should happen. I feel like women's institutions, gender dedicated institutions, and in that I will include institutions like the commissions on the status of women, even the institution that I'm heading at the moment, the Federal Ombudsperson Office, or rather Secretariat for Protection Against Harassment and Protection of Property Rights for Women. These institutions do play a significant role in raising the woman question. And if we strengthen that institution, those institutions further, if there is good leadership in these institutions, and I feel that the data that is being generated is going to be used more frequently and hopefully helpful in a little bit better and more informed policy making. And the second thing that I really would encourage, and this probably goes to the best practices, but not necessarily about the data system, is to promote women's leadership. And women's leadership, and you can also collect data on how many women head institutions and all, and you'll get a pretty dismal picture. Women's leadership is definitely going to matter. When I can tell you that when the Companies Act of 2017 was brought about, which mandated that there is going to be at least one woman director in every company's board, in every company, whether it's a public sector company or a private sector company, there was a mandatory provision for one woman at least in it. A lot of women got an opportunity to join these boards. I personally was inducted into a corporate sector organization purely because of this opportunity, which was brought about due to that policy shift. And the reason why it gets connected to data also is because of the fact that then it is tracked and the companies have to report on it regularly, right? I know that my being there, I can only use anecdotal information or rather personal information. My being there changed the nature of conversation in a corporate sector, a very large corporate, where I understand that profit is the bottom line, but they also have CSR as their element, and that also is now an obligation, the corporate social responsibility. So having women on the table changes brings more focus on how women are being treated in those particular organizations, what measures are taken, even when they are not talking about these issues. Automatically such issues come up as in who's going to take care of the children, and then I know that the daycare centers and all, they come about. So women promoting women in numbers in organizations, but also promoting women in leadership, that is helpful along with just collecting data. Yeah, that's it.
Great. Two last questions. Actually, they're both on the same topic of data collection that we've got from the participants. One is around are there any ethical concerns that we need to keep in mind when collecting and analyzing gender-related data? And secondly, they talk about that it's almost a hostile attitude towards when you go into field to collect women. They often, that community is not very open to sharing information, or that we have to, be respectful towards the social norms of the community. So how can we encourage data collectors to keeping these considerations in mind when they're collecting data, so they can collect data in a more gender-sensitive way? So any thoughts on that, Dr. Hadia? And then we'll get closing thoughts from Ms. Fauzia.
Zora, there are absolutely ethical concerns when it comes to both collecting and analyzing data. So, and I think this connects to the second question about being respectful of community values or norms, etc. All enumerators should be and are required to be given training before they go into the field. Not only that, there is an international review board which reviews all instruments, and we should ensure that this is done on a regular basis for any instrument that is fielded, whether that is quantitative or qualitative. the onus is on the person who is going into the field. You have to make sure that your instrument has been properly vetted. And the International Review Board, what that does is it looks at what are the questions that you are asking. Are there any insensitive questions? Are there concerns regarding how people are going to be impacted by these questions? So in a lot of cases, if you're going to be talking to individuals about issues that might upset them or might resurface some repressed memories, you're expected to have a number in there of some person that you can talk to, a psychologist or anyone from a therapy background. So these are all standards that you are expected to adhere to, if particularly when you start thinking about publications, for example. So this is all expected of researchers or government agencies when you're going into the field. And if you're not respectful, I mean, the respondent is going to pick up on this very, very quickly. There is a whole training that you're supposed to receive on how to make sure the respondent is motivated to continue to talk to you. How do you make the respondent feel at ease? And I think it is imperative when you're going into the field for you to realize that you're going into somebody's home, you're going to be asking them to give you time. In a lot of cases, you're asking them to give you time and to respond to a survey, which they're not going to get any remuneration for. And they're going to give you they're going to bring you into their homes and give you a snapshot of their lives. So this is a big responsibility. And you have to treat it with the same kind of gravity. And this is all standard standard sort of procedure that you go through, standard training that you go through before you go into the field. I mean, I went through it. I make sure that my students go through it. We make sure that we have all the proper documentation in place. And not only that, you're supposed to get consent. And part of the consent is that you tell the respondent that anytime you feel uncomfortable talking to me, just tell me to stop and I'm going to stop. The final thing that I'm going to say is that as a researcher, all data that I receive is actually anonymized. I have no idea who I'm looking at. I don't know their, I should not be able to track them down, basically. This is to protect the identity of the individual. There are protocols in place in certain countries where if you don't have anonymized data, which you might need in order to tackle certain research questions, you have to be on a kiosk or on a computer which is not connected to the internet at all. You'll only be released the data if you can assure the agency that there is no way that you can reshare the data. So there are actually really strict protocols and guidelines in place. And it is ethical to follow those strict guidelines and those strict procedures, because like I said, you're going into somebody's lives and really talking to them about what they're going through.
Great. No, thank you so much for sharing that. Ms. Fauzia would like to add anything or any closing comments?
Just to add to what Hadia is saying, when you're collecting gender data, because this is the question, it is crucial to have women among the enumerators, preferably women who are collecting this data. It is also important to have women as supervisors. Hadia talked about how the questions have to be formulated and how the instrument is designed. That's very important. It must not offend. It must not alarm. It has to be very carefully designed. And fortunately now, there are lots of international best practices, even though we have to still adapt them according to our cultural circumstances. So it's not too much of a problem. Yes, sometimes you have to make provision for a longer time period, like I gave you an example that it took a long time to be able to bring out that information from women, given their circumstances. I feel like in this case, more investment has to be done on the enumerators than on the other side. Enumerators, when you're hiring women, you have to take care of their transportation also. Normally, when enumerators are hired, boys are preferred because they drive motorbikes and all. They're easier to manage. But for women, you have to provide mobility, and therefore they become more expensive. That's what really needs to change. In terms of the enumerator safety, it is integral that they should be linked to some protection agency. For example, in the case of this particular data this particular survey that I was talking about, they had direct access to a hotline of sorts where if ever there was any threat to their safety going from home to home, they should be able to report it immediately. There is also safeguarding training, how to protect themselves against exploitation and abuse, which needs to become a standard procedure. If all of these measures are brought in, I think there shouldn't be a problem. And the question also talked about there is lack of respect sometimes towards their culture, parda, mobility, and I'm assuming they're talking about the communities from which data is being collected. Yes, if you're going to have men only as enumerators, then naturally these things are probably just going to be ignored. A downside and the bigger problem with that is that women are going to be ignored from the data collection. And we've had so many examples where the questions where women are just not brought into the foray, and the data collection is done purely from males. So if we want to address, or rather if we want to augment gender data, we'll have to bring in more women among the enumerators and better training.
And just to add to that, a few more things from my own experience of data collection. I think when talking about consent, it should be an actual consent and not just a token consent. When you've entered somebody's house already and you're sitting, you're saying, can I ask you this? That's not often a real consent. You have to make sure that you're asking a consent when you're actually allowing them to say no and be okay with the fact that they're not sharing some information. And then the most important thing is when you're translating data, a lot of data sets are made in one language and then implemented in another language. And often when you're translating, make sure that somebody from the local context reviews it. So all the language is also sensitive when it's read in that particular local language. But that's also super, super important to make sure it's sensitive. And lastly, only collect the data that you really, really need. Sometimes we have these surveys which ask endless personal information from women, and it's never going to be used. It's have no use. And it has nothing to do with the survey. It's just because we're collecting it. So a few thoughts from my end. And thank you so much, Dr. Hadia, and thank you so much, Ms. Fauzia, for being here. And thanks so much for our great audience here who's sharing questions. This was a great session. And once again, we just like to reiterate that you can't solve a problem if you don't know that it exists and to extent to which it exists. And data really help us understand that and really help us design the right solutions. Therefore, gender disaggregate data, the collection of it, the use of it, and then translating it into policy and practice is super important.